Well, welcome back to small group. There's not very many of these left.
This is the last small group of this year in homes.
This?
Yes.
That's sad.
Let that sink in, folks.
It is weird.
Yeah.
You just gone by quick.
I know. But you get to hang out at our small group retreat.
Yes, that is true. That's coming up. Before we dive into things, why don't you guys take some time to say your name, high of the week, low of the week.
Go.
So we live in a culture that likes to hold on
Wait.
to stuff. What?
We're in the third week of Philippians.
Yes, we are.
So before you dive in.
Yes, we are in the third week of Philippians. First week you opened it up.
Yeah, we talked about God wants to work in your hard stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Last week we talked about a humble God wants us to be a humble people.
Yeah.
By following Jesus' example.
Yeah.
And we're going to dive into the last two chapters of Philippians.
It's
so
going to be a
buckle
lot
up.
of reading.
Mm-hmm. But it's going to be great.
It's going to be great. And then
Good couple chapters.
You've read a whole book of the Bible if you've been here the
Look
whole
at
time.
you go. Gold star.
It's incredible. And so, Paul is going to continue some of the things he's talking about. Paul, if you don't know, was an early follower of Jesus. He originally did believe in God. Jesus showed up, died, rose again, and left earth. And Paul was like, this thing's a bad thing. And so he went off and he started to kill Christians. And then eventually Jesus showed up to him and was like, hey, Paul, why are you killing my people? And I'm actually God. And Paul's like, oh. And so he turned his life around, started a whole bunch of churches, and wrote this book of Philippians because he wrote a lot of the New Testament letters in the Bible. And he wrote it to a church in Philippi, giving them a bunch of instructions and encouragement during a time where they were really discouraged and there was a lot of fear. So we're going to be diving into his conclusion. And before we do, like I said at the beginning, I wanted to talk about how our culture likes to hold on to things. And especially, I was so amped. Especially stuff. And we live in a consumeristic culture in the West. And we like to purchase a lot of things. And then we also like to keep a lot of things that not very many cultures in the world could have the privilege of having shows like Hoarders because they wouldn't be able to hoard stuff. And even there's like things like shipping containers that you can like pay for to store all the stuff that you can't store in your house.
It's pretty crazy.
And that's a pretty common thing.
I know.
Lots of people have storage containers to hold onto their stuff because they have so much stuff that they don't want to let go of, that they have to store it in another facility because they don't have enough space for it. And I am an Enneagram 5.
So what do you like to hold on to? Knowledge.
But, interestingly, the Enneagram 5 is prone to be something called a minimalist, which is weird. And a minimalist, if you don't know, is like a group of people who are very anti-consumerism. That they don't want to hold on to a bunch of stuff, that they want to hold on to a bunch of very specific things. And so they'll hold on to things that they find really valuable, but the rest of it, they can just like toss it out. They don't
Enneagram
care.
is like a personality
it's a personality
test thing. So.
Yeah, that you might know about or not know about.
Yeah.
And so minimalism is actually like this huge thing that was like, especially a few years ago, was a big wave in our culture because it was very countercultural. In a culture that's very consumeristic, to have a subculture of people who are like, actually, we're not going to be consumeristic. We're just going to focus on a few things that we think are really important, and the rest of it, we're not going to hold on to it. And so I began to get rid of a bunch of things that I had that I was kind of like building up, and a lot of stuff from childhood or things from my past where I was like, I just don't need this anymore because I'm a minimalist now.
Right.
And it began to get very difficult because I began to feel like I needed to get rid of things that I really liked and were good, or things that had like sentimental value, and some of those things I held on to, but some of them I was like, if I'm honest, this thing I have, I never use, it just takes up space, and I'm only holding on to it just to hold on to it. And one thing specifically was my childhood Game Boy. I had this like lovely little Game Boy. It was a little square. It was the Game Boy Advance SP, and I had it since I was a kid. And my parents bought it for me, and I kind of just held on to it. And it was one of those things that I looked at when I was like being more minimalistic and looking at my stuff. I was like, I really don't need this. I thought I can get rid of this. This will be fine. But I found that I was just like so emotional in getting rid of it that it was so difficult, even though it was something I felt like I wanted to do, because it was a good thing and it was something that I had value in, but it was also something that I knew that I didn't need to hold on to anymore. And for a lot of us, there's different things in our lives that we have to get rid of, sometimes by choice, and you choose to sell something or get rid of something that maybe has value to you, but you're like, I don't need to hold on to this anymore, like my Game Boy. Or sometimes we lose things that we have no control over. Mm-hmm. And it's things that are good that have just left, whether it was like friendships or people we care about or places that we've lived or sports that we've played, that sometimes those things just come to a conclusion, mm-hmm. and we have to let go of those things. And so I wanted to ask you guys this in your small groups. Are you someone who holds on to things or who lets things go? Why or why not? So like I said, we're going to dive into the book of Philippians. And in these last two chapters, this idea of holding on to stuff and letting go of things is actually going to be really important, and kind of what Paul wants to say lastly to this church. And specifically, he wants to talk to them about their identity and being able to let go of maybe the things they're finding their identity in or their value in, and for good reasons. And he's also going to talk about fear and being able to let go of that and give that up. And so he's going to dive into those two themes. And so if we had a main idea for this last two chapters of Philippians, it would be this. It's that holding on to Jesus starts by letting go. And so, with that, why don't you guys take some time in your small groups to read the entirety of Philippians chapter 3. So in this chapter, Paul talks a lot. Mm-hmm. And he talks specifically about his life before he knew Jesus, before he was a follower of Jesus, because he's kind of addressing some different things. He's addressing some people who aren't very humble, like we talked about in the last thing, some people who've got some big egos, mm-hmm. and who think they're pretty important people. And because of that, they're kind of more important than Paul. And they're like, man, we're important. And Paul wants to remind them. Right after telling us to be humble. He's like, but hold on a second. Well, let me tell you how awesome I was.
I was like, whoa, Paul.
It is funny.
But
it's
again,
an example.
It was, remember, being humble as being...
He's honest.
Yeah. Accurate with who you are.
Yeah.
He's like, you know what, guys? I was a pretty awesome Jewish guy.
Yeah. And so Paul talks a lot about being an Israelite, and so he would have been someone who followed the Old Testament scriptures and like the Torah really closely. He was someone who was a Pharisee, so he was like a religious leader of the Old Testament, mm-hmm. Kind of ideas in the Torah, and he was seen, that's why he was killing Christians, was because he was so serious about...
Which he points out, he's like, was I zealous? Oh
yeah. Yeah, I killed people. That's how intense I was, because I thought they were heretics. Yeah. And so he gives this big, long list of how important he was and all of the good religious things he did and all of the accreditation he has and why he should be respected. But then he says that actually, that in Jesus, he was like, all those things, I count them as loss. They were cool things. They don't
mean nothing, really.
But they don't really mean anything to me in compared to what I have now. That what I have in Jesus is so much better than all of those achievements that I achieved before. And so he's actually choosing to let go of maybe what he was forming his identity on, which was a very zealous religious Pharisee, and in order that he can actually hold on to who Jesus is and embrace Jesus, because he's actually found that it was in Jesus that he found all the things he was looking for in being a very religious Pharisee. And for our culture, I think Paul would challenge something similar, that our culture really struggles with identity and finding it. That we take lots of different things and turn them into who we are, and we set out to achieve different things, which aren't necessarily bad. And so we'll set out to achieve good grades, and we'll set out to achieve like being good at sports, or to be good at a certain video game we like, or to dive into a certain like subculture of nerdiness that we love, whether it's Star Wars or whatever, that we kind of form our identity in that. Or even our culture sometimes struggles with identity to the point of where it becomes about your sexuality, so it becomes about who you're dating and what kind of people you're dating, or even what gender you decide that you are, that you kind of find your identity in these different things, and it starts to become your like pedigree or like your resume.
When you have a pressure to create it.
Yes.
To figure it out.
Because we're constantly told that you need to figure out who you are for yourself, and that you'll finally be truly happy when you can figure out what that thing is.
Be true to yourself.
And achieve it. And be true to yourself in that. And what Paul is saying is that for him, that looked like being a religious Pharisee, but ultimately it didn't lead down the path that he was hoping it would. And so you can see this in people, where people can take grades, for example, which is a good thing. It's good to do well in school. But they start to wrap their entire being around school, where their whole identity of who they are is wrapped around achievement academically. And that can work. And you can feel like you have a solid identity and that things are good. But the problem is that it never fully satisfies you.
And it can be lost.
So that's the thing. You'll never feel satisfied in the sense that you'll always have to chase after the next grade. If someone does better than you constantly feel like, man, I suck, because there's someone who actually is doing more well off than me. Or if you just don't hit the achievement you were hoping for, it can really bring you down. But if you honestly are trying and failing at it, you can feel like you're having an identity crisis, that you're known and have found your identity in being this smart academic person, and you're no longer that. And so if you don't have this, who are you?
Totally.
And you can apply that to anything. You can apply it to sports. You can apply it to, dance. You can apply it to relationships. You can apply it to being well-liked. That all these different things aren't bad.
Well, and it's all the things so this is my question for you guys actually, is how would you describe yourself, right? So it's that random aunt that you meet for the first time, like great aunt or whatever, and she sits down with you for the first time at a family meal, and she's like, so like, tell me about you, like, what are you into? And that's often our identity, is how we think of it. Like, oh, I play these sports, I play this instrument, I hang out with my friends, I love to do art. Like, that's often how we see who we are. And so my question is that if someone were to say, tell me about yourself, like, tell me about who you are, like, what are the words you use to describe yourself? And this isn't bad or wrong. It's just interesting, even for your small group. Like, how do you describe yourself? Or how would you describe yourself to a random aunt at a family dinner?
And so now we're going to get you guys to read chapter 4.
Chapter 4.
And so you're going to read the whole thing in your group. So again, read chapter 4 together, and then discuss maybe some things that stood out to you or questions that you had and chat about it together. So go read chapter 4. So in his conclusion, Paul is letting the church that know that they don't need to worry. Specifically, he's saying, if you guys are experiencing worry, I actually want you to let go of it and to give it to God and to give it to Him through prayer. That instead of just sitting around worrying about the real things that they were facing, and even for Paul himself being in prison, to not just let that consume you, but instead to be able to kind of give that up and to give it to God by talking to God about it. And so Paul, even in the chapter we saw before, when he had a friend who was really sick, they were both worried for the friend, but they also spent time in prayer praying for it. And in that, they were able to let go and give it to God. And that doesn't mean that they didn't feel stress over it. And that doesn't mean that they were like, I don't worry about that anymore. But it means that they were freeing themselves up from carrying that burden. And so he's calling the church to do the same. That in the different ways that they're facing worry, which is real worry of, like, especially for them, persecution at the time, lots of Christians were being killed, that they were really looked down on. A lot of them were struggling, that he's saying, hey, as you're experiencing that, which is a real thing you're feeling, I actually want you to pray about it. And it can seem really simplistic and like, just pray about it. But actually in doing that, you'll find that you're able to start to let go of it and able to give it to God. And I know for me in my life, this has actually been huge. And I'm someone who worries actually quite a bit. That I wouldn't usually typically label myself as a worrier. But when I think about it, I have a lot of anxiety about things and about things happening and making sure that, like, the worst thing doesn't happen and making sure things are good. And it's something I really care about. But often in life, you can't control that. And you can't control the different things that are happening to you. And I would find that I sometimes would get super worried. And at one point, I struggled with panic attacks, but I don't anymore. That kind of disappeared. But I would often feel worry, and I still feel worry. And specifically, even recently, I think it was 2 years ago, I was working a job. I was a pastor. I was living it up.
Best job.
Best job. And it was great. And things kind of happened, though, where eventually I was let go from that job, where they said, we don't want you to work for us anymore. We're going to move on, and you're going to be let go.
No more best job for you.
No more best job for you. Which, for one, if I was finding my identity in me being a pastor, that would have been a huge struggle, because if my whole identity was wrapped around me being a pastor, I all of a sudden was not anymore. And so, luckily in that moment, I was mentored by lots of people to not find my identity in that, and I'm like, oh, that's fine. So I never had like that earth-shattering moment of like, oh no, I'm not the person I feel like I was meant to be, or that never happened. But in that too, I felt a lot of worry, because in being let go as an adult, you have money and you have like debt that needs to be paid, and I was supposed to be getting married and all these different things, and I was like, where I was like, I don't know what to do now because I'm let go from this job. And I didn't choose to be let go from this job, and I have all these different things happening in my life, and bills that need to be paid, and things that I wanted to do and was planning to do, and that's all gone, and I don't know what to do with it. And in that moment, I typically would have been very worried about it. That usually that would be what I do, is just sit around and worry, but for some reason I didn't, and I did something that I don't normally do in situations like that, and I actually chose to just like surrender it. I was like, okay, this is what I'm going through. This is what's happening to me. There's a lot of different reasons why I can and should be worried, but I'm actually going to pray about it, and I'm going to trust God with it. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to automatically get another job. That doesn't automatically mean that I'm going to become a pastor right away again, but it does mean that I don't have to hold on to living in fear over this thing that's happening, even though it's out of my control. And there's things that I really wish would happen, but I'm gonna pray about it instead. And I found, weirdly, a peace come over me that I, looking back, am surprised that I felt. And even Emily kind of talked about it, where she's like, I'm surprised that you're like, she's like, I'm worried. Why are you? You don't seem like that stressed out. And in all honesty, it was because I spent so much time in prayer that even though there was times where I'd be like, oh man, I don't know what's happening, and I hope that this thing works out, that I was able to feel a peace about it because I constantly was bringing it to God in prayer and really did trust that even if things didn't pan out the way I wanted them to, that I was going to be okay. That I knew that I was in Jesus, and I knew where my identity was. And so if I went back to working at Best Buy, that's fine, whatever. I have to do that. That my identity wasn't in being a pastor. But at the same time, if I just didn't have a job and didn't figure things out, okay, what's worst case scenario? I don't have a job, I don't make money, I starve, and then I get to go be with Jesus. Okay. But it's like, I'm going to be okay. And in that too, things did work out for me in that scenario, and they don't always do. There's lots of times I've prayed about worry, and it didn't work out the way I wanted to, but I ended up in a church that I was pumped to be at, and that seemed like, seemed like a great fit. And so it really felt like God did provide in that moment, but even if he didn't, that would have been okay, and that would have been a different story. But I wasn't living in fear like maybe I would have if I had not prayed, because I was letting go of it and not letting it totally control me.
Later in the chapter, where he says, don't worry, but pray, then he talks later about it's the whatever, like, fill your minds with whatever is good, whatever is pure, all of that. And so it's like, he gives you, in a sense, it's like really practical advice where he's like, take it to God, but like that often can feel like not enough. You're like, okay, I prayed about it, but like, do I pray about it all day? Yeah. Like, how am I supposed to spend my time? And Paul's like, and then just immerse yourself in what is good, right? Like, go for a walk, enjoy creation. Like, these things are going to only add to your peace. Focus on what is true. Focus on what is praiseworthy. Like, the list goes on of all these things. And I think for a lot of us, when we're worrying, we actually don't do that. But we just distract or numb ourselves with meaningless stuff. So it's not necessarily bad, but it can be bad, but it can also just be kind of neutral. And Paul is saying if you really want to let go of that fear, you take it to God, and then you like actually go the opposite and fill the void of what you've given to God with really great stuff. And so I wanted to ask these guys, what are their, like, what do they choose to do when they're feeling worried? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what could they choose instead?
Holding on to Jesus starts by letting go. And we live in a culture that likes to hold on to things, and things that are good. And it doesn't naturally come to us to be able to let go of stuff. But it's actually in being able to let go of stuff that we're actually able to find freedom. And so specifically when it comes to identity, that we often want to form an identity on things that are good, but ultimately can't satisfy us and don't make for good gods. That these things that we elevate to this like super high status and make our entire lives about them
Mm-hmm.
will let us down at some point. And we're
Makes
trying...
me think of like a washed up athlete, like professional athletes,
Yes.
is just holding on to that identity, and
Yeah.
we're all like, your day is done,
Your
man.
day is done.
You gotta move on.
You gotta move on. And that's because those washed up athletes, or you and me, are trying to fill some kind of gap we feel in ourselves
Mm-hmm.
that was only meant to be filled by us entering into what we were made to be, which
Mm-hmm.
is partners with God
Mm-hmm.
in being His images here on earth and in
Mm-hmm.
partnering with Him. And it's actually in letting go of those different things that we find our identity in, that we find our true identity, which then gives more life to those things.
Mm-hmm.
So in me pastoring and me enjoying things like video games and golf and even being liked, it's different, where it's like I don't find my identity in those things, but I can enjoy them.
Mm-hmm.
And if I lose those things, if I'm not able to golf anymore, if I can't play video games, if people don't like me, I have this security in my relationship with God. And that was similar for Paul.
Yep.
That he had all these great achievements, but ultimately when it came to knowing God, that was actually so much better to him than all the things that he achieved. And with that too, we're also called to let go of our worry. It doesn't mean you don't experience it and that you don't have worry, but it means that when you're feeling those things, that God actually wants to take that burden on for you and to walk with you in it. And so we're called to do that in things like prayer, even in reading scripture, and even just inviting God into our everyday and into those spaces that cause us worry, that we're able to actually experience a peace that doesn't always make sense. That doesn't mean that things work out and that you always feel peaceful, but it does mean that you're able to let go of that and embrace Him, because it's, in order for us to hold on to Jesus, we need to start by letting go. So next week, we are going to be having our serve night, and so you guys are going to be meeting at the church to make care kits that are going to help people, and specifically going to help people that we'll be interacting with in Vancouver. And so these care kits are going to go to people who are currently experiencing homelessness, or just like areas of life where they're not able to get a lot of basic things they need, like toothpaste or deodorant or awesome things like that.
Yeah. And so we have enough stuff to make 100 kits.
Yeah.
And you guys are going to make them with your small groups.
Yeah.
And we're going to package them all up, and we're going to like write nice, encouraging things on cards to people. And those kits are going to come with us to Vancouver. For those of you who signed up, we're going to deliver them to Union Gospel Mission. And yeah, they've given us a list and said the making kits with this stuff is really helpful for what they do in the day-to-day and how they help people. So that's what our serve week is going to be. And we're going to be here at the church, hanging out, making kits.
It'll be awesome. And then the week after that, things are going to look a little different too, where we would usually have our large worship gathering. And we're still going to have our large gathering all together, but it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to go from 6 until 8, and it's going to include pizza. And so we're going to feed you supper. And a friend named Arlene is coming from Kelowna, and she is going to talk to you guys about sex and dating. That we wanted to bring her in at the end of our Loveology series, and it just didn't work out. And so she's coming in now, and it's actually going to be really great. That she's really smart and thoughtful, and someone who speaks to students all the time about these topics. And so it's going to be a great night of eating pizza, of being able to discuss some really important things, and being able to either address questions or thoughts or concerns you might be having. And so we want to encourage you guys to come to that, and you can invite other people too, that this is an event not just for our youth group, but actually one for our entire community for students. And so don't feel weird in inviting a friend if you feel like doing that. But those are the next 2 weeks of youth. This was your last small group. So sad times. But, you know.
So take time to pray for each other, maybe for your week ahead. Cry together. I don't know. No. Enjoy being together, and we will see you guys next week, maybe in our care kits.